So my name's Dan Scarborough. I'm the person that kind of put this thing together, and I've been speaking to a lot of you electronically, mainly. And I hope you found it interesting so far and beneficial. I am here with Johnny Fry, which is, first of all, a great name. Very jealous of the name Johnny. And I've met Johnny during my journey putting this event together, and I think he's got quite a unique take on the way Web3 blockchain is going to be adopted by more mainstream organisations over a period of time. And I've invited Johnny here to kind of talk about the things that he's seen on his journey and some of the key things that I think are important as two industries collide. I've been next door talking about big data centres and kind of digital infrastructure with, you know, much more kind of traditional enterprise and web scale customers. Ultimately, Web3 exists in these places because a lot of Web3 is built on the cloud, right? It's all built on AWS and that type of stuff. And I think the thought process that we've shared on a couple of occasions gives a bit of insight as to how more traditional businesses are looking at Web3 as a technology, blockchain, the importance of payments and that type of stuff. So, Johnny, can you introduce yourself first? Because you'll do a better job than I have. And then we can have a bit of a chat and see where we end up.
Okay, nice to meet you all. We don't bite. If you want to come a bit closer, I don't mind at all. But we'll. But if not, don't worry. Okay, so name's Johnny Fry. Didn't realise I had a good name, but I suppose it is better than Dan Scarborough because it's all over the place, isn't it? But there you go. So my background is pretty dull, really. I set up in my bedroom a fund management company, and I was at the leading edge of tech because I went out to shop and bought something, a TV with teletext. Anyone know what teletext is? Yeah? Sort of, yeah? Okay. Used to book your holidays on it. And the reason I got teletext is because it was 15 minutes delayed getting stock market prices. So all my clients would have a copy of the Times, the Telegraph, or some of the swanky ones, the FT, and they'd say, oh yeah, I see BP or whatever went up, down, sideways yesterday. And I say, oh yes, but it's actually gone up or down or sideways today. Oh, how do you know that? And I said, well, you know, we've just got our finger or thumb or finger on the pulse. And that's about as far as my technological journey went at those times. So I basically ran a fund management business. We floated it. We bought a stockbroker called Brewin Dolphin. Some of you may or may not have heard of. And they had a range of funds here in the UK and some in Luxembourg. And did that for about 25 years. And to be quite honest, just got bored with it. And one of the frustrations I had, running a publicly quoted, regulated business, I was spending a day a week on compliance and just boring stuff. And thought, well, you know, we've got all these other staff meant to be organising all this stuff. Why are we producing the same reports to different people all the time? Whether it could be the accountants, whether it's the administrators, whether it's the custodians, whether it's the stock exchange. And that's just sort of stuck at the back of my throat. I then went on there and became chairman of a fund administration business, all really dull, all financial services, but really relevant to all of you guys, because whether you like it or not, you now have to save money into a pension fund. You know, when I go back 20, 30 years ago, you had a choice, stupidly, and most people didn't execute that choice correctly and they didn't save money. So all of you, certainly if you work in the UK, you now have to save money into a pension fund because the government run out of money, basically, so you've got to provide for yourself. So this is relevant for you because I came across this thing called blockchain. So if I said to you blockchain, what's the first things that come into your minds? Just shout it out. What does it mean to you, blockchain? Come on, don't be frightened, please.
Trustless.
Trustless, data. What else?
Decentralized.
Decentralized? Shared. Ledger. God, they're all techies, aren't they? What about scam? What about crypto? What about bloody Bitcoin? What about lies and deceit and Silk Road? Kalashnikov rifles and hookers and things like that. When it first came out, that's what it was about. So, has anyone heard of something called an ICO?
Yeah, there was some time.
What does ICO mean?
Initial coin offering.
No. Oh, come on, you're data guys and girls. If you Google it, it comes up with...
Information Commissioner's Office.
Absolutely. And the reason I mention that is because there's a lot of gobbledygook, and there's a lot of people out there trying to peddle, you should buy this token, you should buy this coin, and it's utter dribble, 90% of it. And that's why there's some discussions about, should we just basically consign all this to gambling? But we have to bear in mind that most of the things in this, well, everything in this room is not regulated. They don't regulate chairs or computers or glasses or cups. So why should they regulate these tokens? So there's a lot of confusion. But why is it relevant to an audience like yourself? And I would say it's really relevant because the technology of blockchain, regulators, governments don't regulate technology, luckily. But they do regulate how you use it. So we started looking at how do you use the technology. And I was telling Dan an example. I was talking to a lawyer who tend to be pretty crusty, pretty dull on the whole, get paid far too much money, but that's a completely different story. And he was saying, what are you doing at the moment? I said, well, I'm non-exec on a couple of companies, and I'm looking at this thing called blockchain. And he said, well, what's that then? I tried to explain it, but after a couple of beers, didn't really work. And he phoned me up the next day, or 2 days later, and said, can you help me? And I said, yeah, what do you want? He said, well, first of all, we'd like to pay you. So I knew there was something wrong, because the money never goes that way. It always seems to go that way with the lawyers, but there you go. Sorry, I hope none of you are sort of closet lawyers or real lawyers. And he said, we've got a big petrochemical company, and they've just come into us this morning, and they want us to go back to them and say, how do we use blockchain? And I said, well, that's going to be a laugh, because you were getting confused between blockchain and bogchain last night, or the night before. He goes, no, that's the problem. We would like someone to come in and just talk to them. He said, you mentioned this thing called, little company called IBM. And I said, yeah. And QR codes, what does QR stand for? We all know what it does. Come on, don't be so shy, you lot. What does QR stand for? What do you think? Yet to meet anyone that knows, by the way.
Queen. Is it?
Not Queen. Quick. Quick response. And what IBM found out is that if you put a QR code on an item and then have a history or have a video or have some degree of being able to prove the provenance of that product, people will pay up to 39% more for the product. So I'm sitting in front of the biggest retailer in the world, because in America they've got 68,000 gas stations. Saying, well, what would you be able to do to your profit margin if just 10% of your products, you were able to increase the price by 20%? By being able to prove to them where did that sponge, that jelly, that whatever it is you're selling in your gas stations, where it actually came from. I said, and they said, yeah, but what's that to do with blockchain? I said, because blockchain is a technology which can enable you to do that, because it can show the provenance. And sort of the light bulb went on with this petrochemical company. I'd like to think we had a small sort of say in it, but they went on to set up a quite interesting supply chain business in the petrochemical industry, where they're tracking goods and services in the North Sea, and that's being rolled around the world. And the reason I mention that as an example is that we were showing them an example, arguably in the retail field, which is really nothing to do with, drilling for oil, but actually you can learn a lot from other industries. And so that then kicks off into creating a weekly newsletter analysis, looking at how, where, and who are using blockchain technology and digital assets. And so to bring it back relevant to you and your pension funds, crypto is about 1 trillion. So it's a reasonable sum of money, but it's not really when you compare it to the asset management industry, which according to PwC is 145 trillion, i.e. your pension funds, your ISAs, your savings. So where it's going to start impacting on your lives isn't really whether you buy or sell crypto, but actually with your day-to-day savings. And I'll give you one little example and then I'll stop. And that is, at the moment, let's assume you all have a fund with, you all heard of Schroders? Or Goldman Sachs? Probably all heard of Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs, once a day, let's say you have a Goldman Sachs UK fund. Once a day at, say, it's now 12:30, so let's call it 1 o'clock, you can buy or sell that fund. And the price is made by, guess who? Goldman Sachs. Alternatively, you can do what the US industry has pretty much done, got rid of all their mutual funds. Now there are tax reasons for that. And now you can actually buy and sell 9 to 5, and you have 4 or 5 entities called market makers, and they make a price in the ETF. Well, if you digitize a fund, you go one step further, you can buy and sell 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So in theory, you're all working 9 to 5. Well, how can you look after your money and remember to actually buy and sell and do whatever you want to do with your funds? You can't. You have to use something called a fax. When was the last time any of you used a fax in this room? Do you all know what a fax is? Yeah. Well, believe it or not, so the fund administration business that I'm chairman of, we have to send a fax every day to the Central Bank of Ireland. So in COVID, we got a bollocking because for 4 consecutive days we didn't send them a fax. But we did get a message back, which luckily we took a picture of. We have run out of fax paper, please retry. That's still going on today. 60% of asset managers use fax machines. Now there's that other technology called AI that everyone's talking about at the moment. Something like 90% of all the trading on stock markets and debt markets are driven by algorithms and bots. And everyone's saying, well, AI is going to be the next big thing in terms of how to manage your money. How is an AI machine-driven tool going to open up a filing cabinet and look at a bit of paper or send a fax? So those funds, those equities, those debt instruments that are not digitized will basically just be moved to one side. And those that are digitized, they will be able to be used to do research on, analysis, reporting, and then potentially buying and selling. So rather than looking at this topic as a speculation and gambling, which, yes, it can be, you need to start thinking about how is it going to impact on something which you're familiar with, are your pensions. How is it going to impact on other things, though? How is it going to impact on your data? Your house, your car, your health. How can you sell that data? And that's where I think Web3 comes in and is super interesting because, and I really will stop after this.
So what are the timescales? So if you look at that example, right, and given and you're, on top of this every day of what's going on in the market, how big is the wave and how fast is it coming with these types of more, everyday life things and the use of blockchain Web3 technology? So, because half the problem is that, I don't remember when I didn't have an iPhone, and now I've got, an iPhone 12 or iPhone 13. Do you know what I mean? So things happen, you kind of get pulled along with it. So can you talk a bit about kind of how fast you think that wave is coming and that more kind of mass adoption of this type of technology?
Okay, so don't take my word for it. Look at, there's a little bank called Citibank in America, and they reckon that the value of Web3 is going to be worth somewhere between 150% and 300% the size of the third biggest economy in the world, i.e. between 8 and $13 trillion per annum by 2030. If you look at statistics from people like Knight Frank, Goldman's, Boston Consulting Group, these are all people in theory, they should know what they're talking about. With the greatest respect, you including me, we're just mere mortals. We typically have no more than 5% of our money in alternative investments. If you were a high net worth super investor, i.e. over 30 million, you have 43% of your money in hedge funds, venture capital funds, in jewellery, in fine wine, in cars, etc., etc. So there's a huge disparity between how we invest and how the very wealthy invest. Once you start digitising investments, it becomes very accessible for everybody.
But when you look at decentralisation, right, and the fact that, making something decentral is almost about losing control of it, right? So there's a control aspect. So, and you think about Web3 and you think about all these kind of young kind of programmers that are doing things for corporates to accept something that's decentralized, that's quite a big shift, isn't it? That's quite a big movement.
Yeah, it is. And well, okay, so let's look at what's happening now. London is the centre of the world when it comes to foreign exchange. The next closest rival is 50% smaller, and that's New York. 5% of the FX market is currently being traded digitally. If you then start looking at retail brands that are involved in Web3, so you look at, Nike now gets nearly 30% of its revenue from its digital sales. You've got people like Burberry, Gucci, that are now actually using Web3 as a way to test and market research new products, new styles. I don't understand it, but people are paying more for a virtual handbag. Well, I don't buy handbags, I suppose, to be fair, so I don't understand it, but virtual handbag than a real handbag. Now, it's akin, I think, to the cruise line industry. If you're very, very wealthy, the last thing you really want to be doing is walking around probably any street in any city of the world with your furs and jewels and watches and all the rest of it. The chances are you're going to get mugged. Whereas on a cruise ship, you can have all that on display. Similarly, in Web3, it's a very, very level playing field. And quite a salutary lesson that I learnt 4 or 5 years ago. One of our clients runs an online radio station, goes all over the world, 160, 70 countries, 4.5 million people, and once a week we do a little radio show talking about some of this stuff. This guy, since the age of 10, has been in a wheelchair, and he was telling me how he loves the loves the metaverse. And I was saying, why? He said, because I don't get judged. He said, I can move my wheelchair faster than you can walk, and he's true. You know, I've almost got breaking a run to keep up with him. He said, but I get judged as soon as I walk or wheel in the room. He said, the metaverse, doesn't matter what colour you are, what creed you are, what sex you are, it's irrelevant. And you can immediately have a conversation, you can have interaction with people. And I found that quite interesting. So, you know, we're talking about being inclusive, we're talking about our ESG credentials, all that stuff, and Falcon mentioned it earlier on. This is all part of the mix. And now we've got a technology and we're going to have an environment increasingly whereby it's going to be very, very relevant for all of the companies that you work for. And a lot of it is going to be powered by using different forms of blockchain. And that's the other thing. Most people think blockchain is like the World Wide Web. It's the web. It's the blockchain. No, there's lots and lots of blockchains. There's lots of DLTs, distributed ledger technologies, and they're useful in certain different jurisdictions in certain different ways.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to some of the challenges with the tokenized assets that are out there, there are some like Filecoin who are here today, right, where it's quite obvious what it's doing, right? It's quite a tangible thing. They're decentralizing storage, it's moving storage into multiple different locations. But there are lots of tokens out there that don't have that type of backing. Do you see it splitting in such a way where things are going to be more practical value based in the next few years, as opposed to there are a couple of these tokens that actually do things and lots of them that are just
rubbish?
Yeah.
Well, look, the whole crypto market has been driven by fear and greed. Fear of missing out, greed, you want to make some money. Now, you've probably heard of Bitcoin. It went from 1 cent at one stage to $64,000. That's quite a big increase. You may have heard of something called XRP, Ripple. Well, in 2018, it went up by 38,000% 1 year. So had any of us put $1,000 into that, we wouldn't be sitting here now. So a lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon. And so when we were looking at this in 2016-17, then along came COVID. Guess what a lot of people that were doing sort of crypto, they were selling sanitized gel, face masks. Guess what they're selling now? AI solutions. So there's a lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon. And what we're seeing is there are a lot of these tokens are just rubbish. They really are rubbish. But there are some that actually do have some real value. But again, that's just the minority. And if you go back to what I call the real world, and my old traditional sort of asset management world, big companies don't invest in small companies. Asset managers don't invest in them. What they do is buy funds that specialize in them. And I think we're going to see more and more crypto funds, and great, buy a bit into each of those, but look at your main assets that you have and look at your other assets that at the moment you're not utilising, but you're going to be able to utilise. And healthcare is probably one of the biggest one. and you will be given the ability to share your data for a clinical drug trial, and you'll be given something for it. Or you'll start receiving income, dividends, on investments you have, rather than, at the moment we have a stupid situation whereby if you own a share, you get a dividend every 6 months. Whereas there's no reason why you can't have some of that income payable to you every month.
So let's talk about, why do we need digital cash when we have electronic payments? Can you talk a bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah, okay, so what basically we've done with most of financial services, we've electrified it, but we haven't actually digitized it. And a lot of the times that you're still running manual paper-based systems and processes behind it. So there's a messaging system most of you probably used, if you've rented a flat or bought a house or anything like that. It's called Swift. And that all it is just simply sends messages. NatWest owns BNP that, and BNP owns Goldman's that, or HSBC, or whoever it may be. And it's just sending messages around all the time. And behind that, a lot of them use something called CLS, which is a bank, a New York bank with a second biggest branch here in London. And that's used by about 11,000 institutions. And they say, well, based on your messaging, you've now got to make these payments. Well, there's another company called HSBC, and they have developed something called FX Everywhere. And they're now using FX Everywhere, and now Wells Fargo doing the same, and they're bypassing SWIFT, they're bypassing the CLS because it's cheaper and faster. So you've got in a situation whereby there's $700 billion a year of remittances. So these are the poorest people in our economy. So when we all leave tonight, there'll be a cleaner that will come in and clear up all our mess. There'll be a security guard on duty at 3 or 4 in the morning. They're sending their money, or some of their money, back to so-called, and I hate the term, emerging markets. How bloody arrogant is that? But there you go. But they're sending it back to maybe India or Pakistan or the Philippines or wherever it may well be. And they're being charged for the pleasure of that up to 15%. Now, I have 4 or 5 researchers looking at some of the articles that we do every week in Asia and Africa. It costs me nothing to send the money. It costs them nothing to receive the money. As opposed to about, it's probably conservatively 50 billion a year that the likes of, the payment companies, I better not mention them, but, we all know their names. We've all been on holiday and get wire transfers or the bank. How often do you get ripped off? Most of you have probably got people like Monzo or Revolut or a Starling card, because Barclays, NatWest, et al. Are ripping you off big time when you use your debit card overseas. Now, you're sophisticated. You know how the rules work. But the very unsophisticated, we seem to think it's okay to rip them off. So that's why we're going to see digital. And if you're going to have digitized assets, like funds, equities, bonds, well, you're not going to go back to the bank and say, well, can I have a cheque? We don't use cheque. They've almost been outlawed. But with digital money, we can then go, again, to the poorest members of our community that are paying pounds into their gas and electricity meter, that have a pay-as-you-go phone, and they could actually be paid digitally. There's 1 million people in this country that don't have a bank account. There's 1.4 billion around the world that don't have a bank account. Yet most of them, well, 2/3, according to the World Bank, have got that funny thing called a iPhone. I don't know about its eye, but it's certainly a phone. So, and sorry, to go back to your other question in terms of adoption. So, iPhones, they've now rolled out advanced data protection. I don't know if you've heard of it, but there was a lot of controversy a couple of years ago that the feds thought it was the Al-Qaeda, they'd got an Al-Qaeda or someone's phone, and they went to Apple and said, right, you've got to hack this, you've got to break it, you've got to tell us, because we want to see all the messaging. And Apple said, no, and there was huge controversy. So Apple, in the background, were working on a system so that they could say, we no longer have access. So if any of you have actually traded in cryptocurrencies, you'll know it's a complete nightmare, because you've got to have a password, and then you've got a string of 10 memorable words, and it's just a complete nightmare. Well, that same cryptographic technology is now available on one of these things. So you're the only person that will know how to get access to it. Now, you'd be a bit stupid if you kept it that way. You probably want to give it to your mother, your brother, your lover. Your mum might die. You know what happens to lovers. I haven't got a brother, but my sister's a nightmare. So where are you going to store that information? Because at some stage, we're all going to get a bit older, and someone's got to get access to it so that you can be looked after. And it's not just, and I'm not just talking about crypto here, I'm talking about all of your information about your house, your car, your health, everything that you interface with, and it's all going to go digitised.
So how does that change the person-to-person relationship? Because it means you're decentralising, so it means that you almost don't need intermediaries. It removes the need for intermediaries.
Well, it's going to re-accelerate the peer-to-peer. It's going to, in the past we used to have a barter system. I knew you had some wheat, I had a camel, or I had whatever I had, and we would change, bar. So the oldest form of money that we know of are ray stones, R-A-I, stones. And they found these in the Pacific Islands, and these things are massive. And somehow they quarried them and then sailed 500 kilometres across the Pacific. And these were all based, their value was based on how difficult and how big they were. They were based on something called proof of work. You'd obviously done a lot of work, you've got big stone, therefore it's worth something. And it's the same concept as Bitcoin, interesting enough, proof of work. So they then got the stone back, and it's sitting outside my gaff, and it's worth a measurement like that, which was a large canoe and a hog. That was the measurement of value. And they literally went around the stone and measured it all out. They never moved the stone, but that was a form of credit. So that form of credit and that bartering, that peer-to-peer. And then we got all fancy pants and started having these brokers and dealers and intermediaries and agents. And all they're doing is just taking a little bit out of your pocket. So when I was running a mutual fund, I'd say, yeah, invest in my UK fund, and it's 1.5% annual management fee. No, it's not. It was probably 2.5% annual management fee. Because by the time I'd paid the custodian, the administrator, and the listing fees, and all the other bits and pieces, the charges went up. So the regulator cottoned on to that. So, you must now talk about total expense ratio. So to answer your question, we're going to see more peer-to-peer, which means that if you want to borrow money, it'll be cheaper. If you want to actually lend money, you'll get a better return on your money, as opposed to going through these layers of intermediaries, which, quite honestly, most of them being found wanting, which is why we have all these rules and regulations, because they keep scamming us.
So just to finish off, for the next couple of minutes, can you give us some more kind of examples of some of the traditional enterprises that you've seen and how they're embracing kind of blockchain Web3 technology?
Well, rather than list them out, we often get asked, can you give me an example of, I'm in the fashion industry or the agriculture industry or any industry, not you, your clients, your best clients. Just go back tonight and just put in there, whatever it may be, engineering, trains, planes, doesn't matter what it is, plus blockchain. And I think you'll be very, very surprised to see what's already happening now. We were talking about this quite actively 2016-17, and it was quite difficult. It was very theoretical. There's just lots of proof of works. We're thinking doing this, we might do this. But what we're now seeing is people are actually very much embracing it. And certainly from a financial services point of view, I'm going after this meeting to see one of the clearing banks, a name you all know. They've got 60 people just looking at this to launch a so-called stable coin. So it'd be a digital pound, because their clients are asking them to do this. And they're one of 3 banks that I know here in London that have got teams of 60 odd people. The Bank of England just recruited 30 people to do a similar sort of thing. So this is going to impact all of us. But more importantly, it's going to impact your clients. And if you don't start engaging and talking to your clients about this topic, your competitors will. So the stuff you're involved in, your clients are going to increasingly going to be exposed to it.
So if you take something like Filecoin as another example, are you starting to see that people are more willing to accept different types of services than conventional brands? Like, we don't just have to buy IBM. It's becoming easier to do business on a global basis if you're not a named kind of technology brand.
Well, it's one of the strengths of the technology of blockchain. Again, one thing I'd like you to take away from blockchain, all it is an Excel spreadsheet on steroids. It's just holding information more securely. But the one thing it gives you is transparency. So go back to the QR codes, go back to the example I told you about IBM, where people will charge up to 30 or 39% more. If you've got greater transparency, I don't necessarily need the brand name if I've got trust that actually I can trust never heard of Filecoin, but Filecoin, I'm happy with it because I can trust and look back at what they've done and how they've done it. And the other thing that we're seeing more and more is that, with respect to, I'm a bit older than some of you guys here, and in the 80s it was all about me. It was all about he who dies in most toys wins. And there were horrible pictures of people being driven in their Ferrari, literally in a slope down into the grave and then backfilled because that was, loads of money and all that sort of attitude. Right now, there's much more collaboration. It's a much more collaborative approach when it comes to business. And you're seeing more and more businesses working together because they're realizing that actually working together is much, much more efficient. But to do that, there's got to be an element of trust. And there's certain things they don't want to, certain things Shell don't want to tell BP. Certain things that say, I don't know, another company doesn't want to tell them, but there's certain things they share common goals and they're working together. And that's happening more and more. It's much more collaborative now than it was 20, 30 years ago.
Okay, so my last question for you is sustainability, climate change, carbon. How do you think Web3 and blockchain is going to help in that kind of move towards zero carbon?
Okay, one of the biggest reasons people don't give money to charity because they don't trust where the money goes to. It goes to some sort of administrator. Yesterday in Kenya, I think it was, a couple of £1 million was given by an Asian company, and I've forgotten the name of the company, which basically, because there were two projects that stuck to mind. One, they'd planted a whole load of trees, which they could verify because using Internet of Things and using drones linked back to a blockchain, so they could see the trees are still there, so therefore it's verifiable, and they're paying £6 a tonne for offsetting carbon. The other one is in Rwanda. They actually distributed 5,000 more efficient ways of cooking, little boilers, little cooking devices, as opposed to them going into the bush and burning trees, basically. So they were saying, okay, well, we've got two projects here that we can carry on monitoring to make sure they are going to be valid. So again, using the technology to bring greater transparency, and using the technology, and we often think of blockchain as like a skeleton, and from that will hang big data, machine learning, Internet of Things, AI, and they'll all be working much, much more closely together, and that's what you need if we're going to do something about the carbon footprint that we're developing. We need greater transparency to really understand what we're doing and how can it be improved. But if you don't know what you're doing, it's very difficult to say, well, I've improved on that. So if you've got a record and it's immutable and it's fixed, and then you go forward, then people will get more and more engaged. At the moment, carbon trading is just a complete nightmare, and most of it is just greenwashing. It's just really greenwashing.
Yeah, so blockchain removes greenwashing.
It will help. It'll help. In the same way, digital currencies will help to address the fact that all of you are involved in the shadow economy. Because you've gone to a bar and you said, "Oh, great service, there's a tenner." Well, no, Dan, you're quite flashy. You'd perhaps give £6.50, but that's a different story.
Not with services included, 12.5%.
But when it's digital, you can't do that.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And in some countries, the shadow economy is, believe it or not, 80%. Nigeria had 85% of all the cash ever printed in the mattress. 85%.
Well, you've seen that happen in India, haven't you? Because they removed certain forms of currency, like within a relatively short period of time. And if they
just changed the colour of the banknotes.
Yeah.
I mean, Nigeria were going to do exactly the same, but they stopped because it was just the inflation was hitting 40% for certain goods. So digital money will help. Hopefully, be another tool. It's not the solution, but it will be a potential tool around some of those things.
So, Johnny, thank you very much. Everyone, Johnny sends out a newsletter called Digital Bites. I would highly recommend you subscribe to it. He's got some really good stuff on it.
It is free.
And speak to him if you've got any interesting stories that you think he would be beneficial for him to cover. He's got a massive reach into this community. Thank you very much for coming down. Lunch is served on the main expo floor. We've got a very nice lunch. I chose it. I'm excited about it. I can't remember what it is, but I'm looking forward to it. I remember thinking, I can't wait to eat that. And we will see you back here this afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.